up, pouring your morning coffee, and you're just scrolling through your feed, and then you are hit with this headline that just completely stops you in your tracks. I mean, 300 military drones.
Yeah, sourced from Russia and Iran.
Right. Sitting just 90 miles off the coast of Florida.
It is a really striking visual to wake up to.
Striking is putting it mildly, honestly. I mean, it sounds like a modern-day sequel to the Cold War missile crisis or something. The kind of alert that instantly spikes your blood pressure.
Oh, absolutely.
You read a headline like that, and the immediate thought is like, are we on the brink of a catastrophic attack?
Which is, the exact emotional response those specific data points are designed to elicit. It taps into a very deep historical anxiety we have about the Caribbean.
And that is exactly where we are focusing our attention today. For this deep dive, we are pulling from a highly detailed analytical piece. It was published today, May 17th, 2026, by Habtamu Niniabino.
Right. Drones, deterrence, and the Caribbean. Is Washington reading a real Cuban threat or writing the next chapter?
Exactly. And our mission today is to look right past those sensational, blood pressure spiking headlines. We want to analyze the actual strategic messaging happening beneath the surface from both Washington and Havana.
It is a vital exercise. I mean, especially when the geopolitical stakes are being framed this aggressively.
Definitely. Now, before we get into the weeds here, I want to be crystal clear with you, the listener. The source material we are examining today touches on a highly volatile, really politically charged situation.
Very much so.
We are talking about the Trump administration, Cuba, Russia, Iran, all overlapping in a very tense, immediate moment. And we need to state that we are not here to take a side.
Right, no side taking.
We are not endorsing the viewpoints of the United States government, nor are we endorsing the viewpoints or actions of the Cuban government. Our sole goal today is to impartially break down the analysis presented in Habtamu's piece.
Exactly. We are just looking at the facts presented.
Right. We want to give you the underlying dynamics so you can understand the architecture of this crisis entirely stripped of the political spin.
We're basically using the source material as our map to understand the terrain of international relations. Our job is to read the map, not to advocate for a specific destination.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the Axios report that sparked all this panic paints a genuinely troubling picture at first glance. We have classified intelligence cited by U.S. officials highlighting the Trump administration's growing national security concerns.
Which is a big deal on its side.
Huge deal. We've got Cuba allegedly acquiring over 300 military drones. And then you have the terrifying part, the intelligence detailing contingency scenarios that Cuban authorities have supposedly been gaming out.
Yeah, and the specifics of those scenarios are very pointed. The intelligence points to potential simulated attacks on the U.S. naval base at Guantanamo Bay.
Wow.
Right, and on American naval vessels operating in the Caribbean, and even direct threats to Key West, Florida.
Key West. I mean,
Yeah.
that brings the threat right to the American mainland. But when I was reading through Habtamu's analysis, looking at the raw data versus the actual panic, I kept coming back to this analogy.
Let's hear it.
It's like looking out your window and discovering your neighbor who, you've had a hostile relationship with for decades, just bought a massive cache of high-end security cameras.
Motion sensors, floodlights, the whole works.
Exactly. And they pointed every single one of them directly at your shared property line.
It creates an immediate sense of menace, for sure.
It looks aggressive,
Yeah.
but, does the purchase of that equipment actually mean they are planning to kick down your door tonight? Or does it mean they are highly paranoid, feeling pressured, and just trying to send you a blindingly clear message to stay off their lawn?
And this is where we have to establish a firewall between raw data and analytical panic. The core distinction that the source material anchors on is a fundamental rule of intelligence,
Which is,
that intelligence assessments do not equal operational intent.
let's hover on that for a second, because that feels like, I don't know, the golden rule for consuming modern news.
It is essential. Just because an adversary has examined a scenario, just because Havana has run a tabletop simulation on how they might deploy drones around Key West or Guantanamo Bay, does not mean they have the intent to do it,
Right.
or, frankly, the capacity to execute that plan. Militaries run simulations for literally everything. In fact, if you read the fine print of the Axios report, the U.S. officials cited quietly acknowledge that an attack is not considered imminent.
Wait, really? So the headline is screaming fire, but the fine print is essentially saying, well, we just found some matches in the drawer.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Because you have to look at the physical, military reality on the ground. Cuba completely lacks the conventional military capabilities to take on a major superpower like the United
They
States.
don't have the hardware.
Not even close. They do not have a modern naval fleet, they do not possess overwhelming air power, and, their economy is crippled. Launching a conventional, unprovoked war against the U.S. military would be instantaneous suicide for Havana.
Which creates a massive logical friction here. I mean, if they know a conventional fight is unwinnable, why are they throwing what little money they have into a stockpile of 300 drones?
That's the real question.
Right. If this isn't the prelude to a full-scale assault, what is the underlying logic of acquiring weapons from Russia and Iran when your economy is struggling to even keep the lights on?
Well, what's fascinating here is how fundamentally the global philosophy of warfare has shifted, and how quickly smaller nations have adapted to that shift.
You mean like what we've seen in recent conflicts?
Exactly. We already saw in the Black Sea how a state with virtually no traditional navy can use cheap surface and aerial drones to cripple a vastly superior fleet.
Oh, right, the Ukraine war footage.
Yeah, Havana watched the exact same footage from Ukraine that we did. They are essentially attempting to copy-paste that asymmetric playbook directly into the Florida Straits.
Let me push back on that a bit, though. I mean, the United States Navy is not the Russian Black Sea Fleet. We are talking about Arleigh Burke-class destroyers and Aegis combat systems. Does a swarm of cheap drones actually deter the U.S. military, or does it just annoy them?
It isn't really about sinking an aircraft carrier, though. It's about the cost-exchange ratio.
Okay, break that down for me.
Sure. So when you launch a $20,000 loitering munition, essentially a kamikaze drone, the defending ship has to shoot it down with an interceptor missile that might cost, say, $2 million.
Wow, $2 million for a $20,000 drone.
Exactly. If Cuba launches a networked swarm of 300 drones, they don't need to destroy the U.S. Navy. They just need to saturate the radar, force the expenditure of hundreds of millions of dollars in interceptors.
And hope one slips through.
Right. Create the risk of a single drone slipping through and hitting a flight deck.
Yeah.
That completely changes the political calculus of an intervention.
It makes me think of the porcupine strategy.
The porcupine strategy, yeah.
Like, Cuba knows it is a small animal living right next to a massive apex predator. It knows it cannot win a physical wrestling match with a bear. So instead of trying to become a bear, it just grows enough quills to make swallowing it an absolute nightmare.
That is a perfect way to look at it.
The drones are the quills.
It is the geopolitical equivalent of making yourself physically unpalatable.
Yeah.
From Havana's perspective, this acquisition isn't a blueprint for aggression.
Right.
It is a calculated strategy of asymmetric deterrence. For small, heavily sanctioned states facing larger powers, the goal is simply to acquire capabilities that dramatically increase the friction and cost of any potential intervention.
Even just having those drones symbolically parked 90 miles away creates operational uncertainty.
Absolutely. The objective is to raise the political and military price of an intervention so high that Washington decides it simply isn't worth initiating.
Okay, so the porcupine is growing its quills. It makes logical sense from a defensive posture, especially given the global shift toward drone warfare we just talked about. But if this is just standard asymmetric deterrence by a smaller nation, something military planners analyze every single day, why is Washington reacting with such intense public alarm right now?
That is the million-dollar question.
Why leak this intelligence to Axios and frame it as a looming national security crisis today?
That brings us to the geopolitical timeline, which is honestly the real engine of this story. In international relations, timing is rarely a coincidence. Habdamu's analysis highlights that these drone allegations are arriving at a moment of rapidly escalating, multifaceted tensions between the U.S. and Cuba.
We are talking about pressures that go far beyond just military hardware, right?
But further, we are looking at a convergence of legal, economic, and diplomatic assaults. For instance, the analysis notes that the Department of Justice is reportedly preparing legal action against Raul Castro
over the 1996 Brothers to the Rescue incident. For listeners who might not remember the details of that or maybe weren't born yet, we need to explain what that is, because it is not just a minor historical footnote.
Far from it. In 1996, two small civilian planes, Cessnas, flown by a Miami-based Cuban exile group called Brothers to the Rescue, were shot down by Cuban MiG-29 fighter jets.
Over international waters, right?
Yes, over international waters. 4 Americans were killed. It was a profoundly traumatic event that led directly to the U.S. passing the Helms-Burton Act, which drastically tightened the embargo on Cuba.
So bringing a 30-year-old emotionally charged, historically explosive event like that back into the active legal crosshairs right now, that isn't just a random DOJ update.
Not at all.
That is a deliberate diplomatic weapon designed to apply maximum pressure on the Cuban regime.
It is a massive escalation, and it is happening simultaneously with reports that additional severe U.S. sanctions are imminent. The policy discussions in Washington are becoming increasingly confrontational.
The pressure cooker is whistling. And Cuba isn't just quietly absorbing this, are they?
No, they have pushed back sharply on the global stage. Cuban Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez Parilla went on the record to accuse Washington of essentially fabricating a fraudulent case.
A fraudulent case.
Right. His explicit argument is that the U.S. is deliberately hyping up this drone narrative to justify the impending sanctions, or potentially to lay the groundwork for direct military action. He insists Cuba is purely seeking self-defense.
Now, if you are listening to this, your immediate reaction might be to just roll your eyes. Like, of course the Cuban foreign minister is going to claim self-defense and accuse Washington of making things up.
It's the standard playbook.
Yeah, that is the natural default setting for adversarial diplomacy. But the source material makes a really crucial point here. Dismissing that accusation outright might be a mistake.
We have to look at the history of U.S. foreign policy objectively. Security threats historically often serve a dual purpose for Washington.
Let's break down that mechanism. How does a single intelligence report serve two masters at once?
Well, on one hand, the intelligence addresses a genuine operational concern. The 300 drones likely exist. They are a new variable in the Caribbean, and the Pentagon absolutely must plan for them.
They have to do their job.
Exactly. But simultaneously, the public framing of that threat, leaking it to the press, highlighting the Key West scenarios, that creates political legitimacy for broader strategic objectives.
I see.
You use a genuine military detail to build public consent for economic sanctions or legal actions that you already wanted to pursue anyway.
Here is where it gets really interesting. When I was reading Habtama's breakdown of the Axios report, there was one specific phrase that practically jumped off the screen.
The pretext quote.
Yes. The report actually included an admission citing U.S. officials that this intelligence, and I am quoting directly here, could become a pretext for military action.
That specific wording is extraordinary to see in print.
It is staggering, because pretext does not mean a justified defensive response to an attack. Pretext means an excuse. It means a narrative you intentionally construct to do something you are already looking for a reason to do. Why is that specific phrasing so crucial for you, the listener, to understand this entire standoff?
Because it is an open acknowledgement that the intelligence is being weaponized through a political lens. The author makes this very clear. Calling it a pretext does not mean the intelligence is fabricated.
The drones are there.
The drones are real. The contingency plans were likely drafted by Cuban officers. But the story being told about them to the American public is a deliberate political choice.
It ceases to be about the facts on the ground and becomes entirely about how those facts are deployed to shape the narrative.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we see a long-established tradition of nations shaping public consent to align with strategic goals.
Like what? Give us some examples.
Look at the Monroe Doctrine in the 19th century, which established the baseline of U.S. dominance in the Americas. Look at the anti-communist containment strategies during the Cold War, or look at the post-9/11 security doctrines. In every single case, genuine security concerns were seamlessly woven into much larger narratives that justified expansive, sometimes aggressive foreign policy moves.
So when Washington points at these 300 drones and sounds the alarm over Key West, they are setting stage. They are framing an emerging asymmetrical threat through a broader historical doctrine of hemispheric control.
Exactly.
Yeah.
While Havana, by flaunting the drones and leaning into the porcupine strategy, is displaying its deterrent capacity. It is a dialogue.
A very dangerous dialogue.
Very. The real story isn't about whether a drone is going to launch toward Florida tomorrow. It's about both sides entering a new, highly volatile phase of strategic signaling.
It's a high-stakes conversation being conducted through military hardware, leaked intelligence, and resurrected 30-year-old legal cases. We started this deep dive by comparing the headlines to the Cold War missile crisis, the quintessential geopolitical standoff.
Nuclear weapons sitting 90 miles from American shores.
Exactly. But the geography might be identical. The underlying mechanics are fundamentally different.
They are. The missile crisis was existential. It was about weapons that could literally end human civilization in an afternoon. This current tension feels different.
It is about something smaller physically, but potentially just as potent in how it shapes policy.
We are dealing with drones, competing intelligence narratives, and fundamentally different interpretations of what constitutes a threat.
Right, like a nuclear missile is an undeniable threat. A stockpile of defensive drones is like a Rorschach test for geopolitical intent.
It's a great way to put it. Habdamu ends the analytical piece with a quote that I think perfectly encapsulates this moment. History rarely repeats itself exactly, but sometimes it rhymes.
It is a really perceptive conclusion. We are not looking at a carbon copy of October 1962.
No, the stakes are not nuclear annihilation.
Right, but the underlying mechanics, the geographic proximity, the deep-seated mistrust, the use of military assets to send political messages to domestic audiences, they're playing the exact same tune.
And this is why it is so incredibly important to pay attention to how you consume the news.
Absolutely. The headlines you read over your morning coffee, the push notifications that make your phone vibrate, they aren't just neutral deliveries of facts. In international relations, they are often weapons in a much broader narrative war.
They are tools.
Yeah. When you see a terrifying headline, you have to ask yourself, who benefits from me feeling afraid right now? What policy or what sanction is this fear paving the way for?
That requires a profound level of media literacy. Public consent is the engine that drives international action. By analyzing these narratives, instead of just reacting to the alarm bells, you regain your agency. You are looking at who is pulling the lever and asking why.
Let's take a step back and look at the whole board we've laid out today. We started with what felt like an impending disaster. 300 military drones from Russia and Iran pointed at Florida, triggering national security alarms in the Trump administration.
A scenario explicitly built for maximum public anxiety.
But as we unpacked Habtamu Niniabino's analysis, we revealed completely different reality. We aren't looking at an imminent invasion fleet. We're looking at a complex, multifaceted geopolitical chess match.
We explored how Cuba, lacking any conventional power, is utilizing the harsh lessons of modern drone warfare. They are embracing asymmetric deterrence, the porcupine strategy.
Right. Using relatively cheap technology not to conquer territory, but to dramatically complicate the math for the U.S. military.
We also connected the sudden spotlight on this intelligence to the rapidly escalating political timeline, the potential DOJ action dusting off the trauma of the 1996 brothers to the rescue incident,
The threat of new crippling sanctions.
and the Cuban foreign minister's accusation that the crisis is entirely fabricated.
And perhaps most importantly, we broke down how intelligence serves a dual purpose. It identifies physical realities, yes, but it is simultaneously interpreted through a political lens to shape public consent, echoing historical doctrines of hemispheric control.
The facts are real. The drones are sitting there.
But the story being told about them, the narrative of imminent danger to the American mainland, might just be a strategically constructed pretext. It is an incredible reminder that in international politics, the most powerful weapon isn't always the loitering munition in the sky. Sometimes it's the headline on your screen.
It is a really challenging environment to navigate as a citizen.
It really is. Which brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with today. Something to chew on long after you finish that coffee. We've talked extensively about how intelligence can be openly acknowledged as a potential pretext for military action. We've seen how strategic signaling works and how facts are molded into political weapons.
Right.
So here's the question. If the mechanisms of statecraft now rely so heavily on shaping public narratives, if the lines between defensive deterrence and manufactured provocation are this blurry, how can you, the everyday citizen, ever confidently distinguish between a genuine physical threat to your safety and a geopolitical narrative being manufactured in real time?
That might be the defining epistemological challenge of the information age.
Next time you see a headline about 300 drones or a looming crisis, remember the porcupine. Remember the dual purpose of intelligence. Keep questioning the narratives, keep looking past the sensationalism, and keep seeking the why behind the what. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.